So this next section is on children's spirituality, as I said, and we will be moving into questions in this session as well. So the first speaker on this topic, of course, is our very own, the Reverend Canon Doctor, I don't know if I'm saying it all in the right order, Neil Mancor. So Neil, my good friend, I'm going to mute myself and invite you to unmute yourself and take it away.
Yeah.
And I've got 9 minutes on the clock. Here we go. I'm talking about children's spirituality through the lens of messy church. And the question I just put to us around this is this: are children empty vessels that need to be filled with information, led to God, taught how to pray, or are children innately spiritual and able to explore faith and life and God and prayer in all sorts of wonderful and exciting and creative ways? Because how we answer that question will shape what we think about children's ministry. And actually, as I thought about all of this, I find what's true for children is probably true for most of us as adults too. This is Messy Church. If you haven't heard of Messy Church, in summary, the values of Messy Church are creativity, hospitality, celebration, all age, and Christ-centered. So Messy Church is church. It's an expression of church for people of all age. So we welcome everyone to Messy Church. We value creativity. So we use craft and science experiments, and we use drama to tell the story and to think about things and explore faith. We value hospitality. We eat together. We welcome people at a time convenient to them. We celebrate because church is about joy and fun, and we celebrate our faith. And the buckle which holds it together is Christ-centeredness, because Messy Church is church. It's not a babysitting service. It's not a craft club. It is something for everyone of every type of family to come together and explore faith. And so when we think about children's spirituality, how might something like Messy Church foster that? Well, it does it in a few different ways. I think a big thing is that it's all age. So Messy Church brings together children and adults rather than separating them into separate things, upstairs and downstairs. The serious business of adults in church, the business of children downstairs until the day that they're ready to go upstairs. The Messy Church says childhood is not a preparation for adulthood. It's a wonderful time. And adults and children are all able to express faith together, to share together, to find joy together, to experiment and explore together. And so that means that Messy Church isn't something we think about as doing to children, but as life that we share with children. And so that's a big difference, and it's an important thing. It's also creative. You might recognize this from earlier. But creativity isn't just because it's fun. It's open-ended. It creates a space. It allows us to make meaning. It allows us to grow and to explore on our own. The point behind the crafting of Messy Church isn't simply the product. We don't make sheep with toilet rolls and cotton batting just for its own sake. As we craft or do science experiments or do drama, we're creating space for people, for children, for adults to explore, to experiment, to try out, to think, because the Spirit works awesomely through creativity. It's not the finished product that's the point, it's the long journey. But what that allows space for is for children to be agents, active agents in shaping their own spirituality. And sometimes church is just a whole lot of fun. We also pray together in Messy Church. And there's a lot of prayer in Messy Church all the time. We pray during the celebration. We might write short heart prayers and share them. We might write prayer on a leaf and hang it on the prayer tree. I was at a Messy Church conference where we all colored rocks and thought about how Jesus called his friend Simon Peter the rock. And we thought, well, what might Jesus call me? You see, we have an expansive experience of prayer in many different ways. And so we place prayer in children's hands, not as little adults needing to be trained, but as spiritual creatures able to relate to God in different ways. We also nourish. Messy Church is nourishing. The dinner part of Messy Church is very, very important. There's always a dinner. There's craft, there's celebration, and there is dinner. It's so important because dinner is the gift of love that we give to all the people who come. But it's also the place where family happens. And I'm defining family in the widest possible sense, where people of all sorts of backgrounds can come together and create community and family. And we sit down. Well, sometimes we sit down, but actually there's a lot of sitting down and running all around as well. It happens at dinner like that. And gravy gets on the table and juice gets spilled. And yet, in this way, we say that children are not just little noisy creatures to be silenced, to be bribed during the service so that we can do our adult thing. It's that all of us together share in this meal, and we are all at the table, old and young and everyone in between, which means that children are members and they are worthy of being included and nourished. Lastly, Messy Church is just messy. And there's a lot of glitter on the floor and children running all around. The greatest gift of Messy Church, I think, is a church with glitter on the floor. If I see glitter on the floor of a church, I think that's a church with its priorities right, because it knows that making space for joy and for fun, for creativity, for exploration is more important than keeping everything just in order. Same thing with children running around. Because when you have a messy church and you have lots of children, they're going to start running around your building. They're going to start playing. And yes, they're going to be playing in church. And as they do that, they're exploring church. They're exploring it for themselves and finding their own sense of ownership of church. So these are just some of the ways in which church fosters children's spirituality. And I think the real question behind it is, do we realize that it's just as important for us as adults too? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. Look at you. No prompting needed. Right on schedule. Thanks so much. The next speaker is Amy Crawford, and she will be talking on the topic of godly play. Amy came in late, so glad that you are able to make it at all. It is our privilege to welcome you, Amy.
So thank you. At the heart of godly play is the understanding that children do come to us as spiritual beings. So Neil, I'll respond to your question that they don't come as empty vessels. They already have an experience and an understanding of the holy. And we also recognize that experiencing spirituality does not depend on how much we understand or how much we can explain, but it is about our capacity for being with God and God being with us. So we nurture children's spirituality by recognizing and supporting God's ways of being with children and children's ways of being with God. Now, godly play is the life work of the Reverend Dr. Jerome Berryman, who began developing godly play over 40 years ago and continues to be active with children and to be active in the process of honing and crafting both the language and the process of godly play. Somewhat more recently, but still about 25 years ago, Dr. Rebecca Nye began some research on children's spirituality, which has very much grounded some of our thinking in Godly Play about children's spirituality. And Rebecca is a Godly Play trainer in England as well. Now, I'm going to name just three things, three spiritual needs of children and how we support these spiritual needs in Godly Play. So number one, children need to be listened to. Often we as adults are anxious about offering children time to ask their big questions about death, freedom, aloneness, meaning, evil, or sacredness. We worry about how we will answer those questions. But in Godly Play, we intentionally use story, time, and silence to give children a religious language, both verbal and nonverbal, to wonder about and wrestle with those big questions. We teach children a language of biblical story and Christian practice, which not only helps them do their own wondering and wrestling, but it provides us as adults with a language and a posture to respond, not necessarily to answer those questions, but to respond with our own genuine wonder. Number two, in the spiritual needs of children. Children need to be respected. This means that we adults need to be aware of what kind of presence we are and whose presence we are in. It is easy for adults to have our own needs override the needs of children. So often our presence can be controlling or demanding or signaling our need to be liked or to be pleased. In Godly Play, adults sit on the floor amongst the children, signaling a mutuality of relationship and of spiritual seeking. We take their questions seriously, and we take seriously their responses to our questions. I'm sure some of you have been in settings where children respond to something and everyone laughs at them, when really they weren't trying to be funny. So we take children seriously. Now, it doesn't mean that it's all serious and dour. We also realize and recognize the importance of playfulness, and we have an understanding of the importance of the play in Godly Play. And I think we all know that Jesus had a lot to say about respecting children. Matthew 18 says, he called a child whom he put among them and said, truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And take care that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I tell you, in heaven, their angels continually see the face of my Father in heaven. So children need to be respected. Number three, children need good quality space. And the space around children, we think of in many senses: physical and visual space, and emotional and auditory space. Now, I remember as a child making or finding my own spaces to be in trees, in hiding places, in the attic, in closets, in swings, and collecting special things to have in my own space. At that time, I wouldn't have thought of this as spiritual work, but now I think likely it was. In Godly Play, we try to ensure that the space for children is the very best it can be. We avoid a chaotic, overstimulating, and ever-changing or overcrowded physical and visual space in order to help children nurture their inner space. Too soon. We give emotional space and time for children to process things in their own way. And we come back to the cycle of stories, or what we in Godly Play call the spiral curriculum of Godly Play stories, in order for children at all ages to process their emotions and learn a religious language that can grow with them. So it's not a constantly changing, always something new sort of curriculum or way of being with children. We also provide a variety of response materials, but we do not seek a particular outcome or to create a particular product when we are with children. That space is meant for them to be creative and responsive in their own way to what they are hearing and what they're wrestling with and wondering about. And finally, we give children auditory space, silence, to assist in meeting their spiritual needs. As you're likely aware, positive experiences of silence are in short supply in our world today. And as adults in Godly Play, we're intentional about speaking less and with more pauses for reflection. Holding a moment of silence can also be a mark of respect and presence, to mark the special quality of something a child has said or done. They don't need adoration or praise sometimes. They just need your silence and presence. So the use of silence is intentional to contribute to the acknowledgement of being over doing, and to support children in their special spiritual gift, which is non-verbal knowing. So just briefly, a Godly Play session includes a greeting at the door and an intentional crossing of this threshold, entering the space in a meaningful way. Gathering in the community on the floor in a circle. There's a centering song or prayer, and then we hear the story. We respond to the story through wondering and art or play, and then we share a feast and prayers together and offer a blessing and dismissal. And if that sounds like an experience that you have in church, that is what it is meant to reflect. The languages of Godly Play that we use are sacred stories of the Old and New Testaments, which are stories of God coming close to people and people coming close to God. The parables, which are perhaps the most authentic voice of Jesus that we have in Scripture, is one of the languages of Godly Play. And then we have liturgical stories, which share the practices of the church and mark the seasons of the church year. And finally, again, the language of silence. And that is all. Let's see, let's stop sharing.
That was wonderful. I really appreciate all of that. Thank you so much. I know somebody put in the chat that Dr. Berryman will be speaking at a symposium on children's spirituality next week.
Excellent.
If you would want to learn more about Godly Play. Thank you so much. I will invite now our next speaker on the topic of spiritual direction for children, Archdeacon Linda Borden Taylor.
Thank you, Leanne, and good morning to everyone. How wonderful it is to be here with you today as we celebrate the gift of children. I'm especially thankful to have this opportunity to share with you the ministry that has become close to my heart, spiritual direction with children. I have been a spiritual director with adults for the past 30 years, but over the past couple of years, I've had this pulling and tugging within me to look at what that might be to have spiritual direction with children. Amy has given us a nice segue into this topic because one of the things I loved doing the most as a child, and maybe most of us, was play. Whether that would be jumping rope or kicking the ball or nudging those beautiful colored marbles across the ground. There were so many ways that I could be active. Sometimes, though, I would be active in a different way with my imagination. And so whether I was thinking of being a pilot or a teacher or a scuba diver, I could enter into this imaginary world. But there was also that part of me that loved to be still, especially in the outdoors, where I could feel the breeze, listen to the bird song, or watch a butterfly move over the garden. And it is what many writers on children's spirituality call wonder. There is that sense of wonder. And in that wonder, there is a moment in time when it seems that the child is pulled through an invisible barrier into another realm, where the world as we know it seems to make way for something far deeper than what we know and see in our day-to-day living. So if you have ever observed a child in their stillness, you will know what I mean. We might even call this a state of contemplation or perhaps meditation, because children are naturals at this spiritual practice. Dr. Noel Keating, an educator in Ireland, has given a good amount of his work life focusing on meditation with children. And he is the coordinator of the Meditation with Children project in Ireland. And to date, this project involves approximately 32,000 children who meditate several times each week across 150 primary schools. So the evidence is clear. Children like to meditate. I often think how wonderful that would be if we could encourage our children to meditate in this very complex world. And as we've heard from others, the other thing that children like to do is to tell stories. Just as they are with meditation, children are natural storytellers. And it's amazing with a little prompting just how far they can take you on a journey into their world if we just take the time to listen. There is something uniquely different that happens when accompanying children in this way, when we offer ourselves to listen deeply with our whole being. And I wonder, who were the people who first listened to you? Because there was someone. It might have been a teacher, a relative, or a member of your church community. For myself, it was my paternal grandfather, quiet, patient, attentive, without instruction or judgment. And those are two key words in our spiritual direction with children. We are not there to teach. They will teach us. So I wonder, who was that person for you? If we just give children the space and time, they will share the deepest self. Children, when they know they are truly being heard, will invite you into their world of wonder, of beauty, of goodness, of sorrow, and of loss. And sometimes through our asking a simple question, a child will begin to share the most precious parts of their life. A question like, will you tell me? Will you tell me about your day? Will you tell me where you saw God moving in your life? Will you tell me about the most beautiful thing you have ever seen? As a result of my recent studies in the area of spiritual direction with children, I have recognized that there are also times when we might want to introduce children to various creative tools that will assist them. And as I reminded us at the beginning of my talk, children love to play, and in spiritual direction, we can invite them into play in a particular way. And I think Leanne is going to show us one of those tools. They are called holy listening stones, and they have been developed by, the other one. They have been developed by the Reverend Dr. Leanne Hadley. And they are small enough to be held in the child's hand, and at the same time, allowing them to focus. Listening stones can act as a prompt to bring to mind something a child might want to express. There are 28 stones, each with a unique symbol on them. And again, through invitation, we invite the child to choose a stone and what that might speak to them. And it's amazing how this one small stone opens the space for the Holy Spirit to reveal something unique and wonderful about the child. There is no particular meaning attached to each of these symbols. They are whatever they speak to the one in whose hand they are held. Another tool that is sometimes used to assist the conversation with children is the finger labyrinth. And you can make one out of cloth, just large enough to fit in the palm of your hand, using wool glued to the fabric to trace a simple labyrinth template, and invite a child to make the journey to the center while they share with you about their day. And they may start out with a particular event or happening, but the longer they move through this exercise, you will hear their story change and expand. And then there is the use of color. It is always helpful to have some watercolors on hand when working with children in spiritual direction. When a child is expressing those deep stirrings in their life, again, we might invite with a question, can you show me in colors what that might look like for you? There are so many ways in which we can encourage children to express those depths of movements that are waiting to surface. And I would be happy to share more. But talking about spiritual direction with children and walking alongside a child are two very different things. So instead of more from me, I would like to leave you with an invitation this morning, a spiritual exercise of sorts. Consider a child whom you know, who might benefit from a holy listening friend, and invite them into a conversation with a question, will you tell me? and then listen. Listen deeply from your heart.
Thank you. Thank you kindly. I will invite Sean Danielle to be our next speaker on the topic of children's spirituality. Sean Danielle, you can unmute yourself, and I will not give you a warning out loud, but I'll just write in the chat when your 1 minute comes. Thanks.
Well, thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank all of the previous presenters. I'd like to continue on from Caitlin, Edward, and Bishop Mark specifically, because they spoke about hard topics, and I want to meta talk about talking about hard topics with children. In the 18th century, my favorite pastor in history, possibly ever, Jonathan Edwards, a Puritan minister in my home state of Massachusetts, gave the first documented example of a children's sermon we have in the Western Protestant world. The first time a pastor pulled kids up front for a special message with Pastor Jonathan. And he told the kids that they would all die, that it was presumptuous to assume that they would get old. Listed some possible ways that they might die young, including you might drown in a creek, you could choke on a betel nut, or you might get an infection from getting a cut by thorns, and that they'd all better be ready for Jesus. Jonathan Edwards is a model for children's ministry, and I'm completely serious. Why does this 18th century Puritanism terrify us? Are we more scared of his theology, or are we really just deeply uncomfortable with the fact that he said all of that to kids? Is he a case study in what not to do? I actually think in the context, Jonathan Edwards was remarkably courageous and pastoral. Numerous children in his parish had recently died. The death of children was not a mean pastor issuing a threat. It was a reality, and it was a reality that the kids knew. They didn't need adults to dodge reality to protect their feelings. Mortality was and is a fact. Those kids in 18th century Massachusetts had a great pastor. My thesis is simply this. Children are already spiritually mature. I believe our age differences between toddler and elderly that we find in our church pews are eternally statistically insignificant. We are not as much more mature than the kids as we like to, for our own self-esteem, pretend. Jesus said we are called to be like children to enter the kingdom of heaven. Sometimes in the commentaries, that's described as some sort of passive acceptance and meek humility, an interpretation clearly made by people who didn't work much with children. I would argue that relentlessly asking why might be why Jesus told us to be more like the children, that is a maturity that we are actually called to emulate. I think of my favorite author from when I was about 12 years old, Douglas Adams. He wrote in a sci-fi comedy book this profound wisdom. I must be like a child. If he sees a thing, he must say what he sees, whether or not that was what he thought he was going to see. See first, think later, then test. But always see first. Otherwise, you will not see anything except what you were expecting. Don't you understand that we need to be childish in order to understand? Only a child sees with perfect clarity because it hasn't developed all of those filters which prevent us from seeing the things we don't expect to see. Think about the perfect clarity that comes when you are not biased by your expectations of how the world does or should work. Think of how children see things perfectly because they're not pre-concluding how they ought to be. As someone who's focused my professional life on the pastoral care of the very young, from summer camps as they face the first night away from home, or in a pediatric intensive care unit as they face their own mortality as children. As someone with just enough experience in the wider church, in parishes, and on call in other units of the hospital, I can tell you this. The idea that adults are more spiritually mature is a self-serving adult delusion made up by adults who don't know themselves and don't know children, with very little evidence behind it. We are more experienced usually, but not always. There are 8-year-olds who've seen more of the world's horrors than some of you have in your adult life. We're more experienced usually, But we often have developed that experience into avoiding confronting reality more than developing it into confronting reality. And that is not maturity. St. Paul says that maturity spiritually is seeing through the glass clearly, seeing what is really happening. Kids know how the world works and their experiences within it already. Kids know this even if they don't have the vocabulary for it. A lack of vocabulary is not a lack of experience. A lack of vocabulary is not a lack of wisdom. And this simple principle is essential in ministry and all relationships, with puppies, with children, with people who are engaging with you in their second or third language, with people who have any reason to struggle with communication. The lack of vocabulary is not the lack of experience or wisdom. A lack of vocabulary is not a sign that a child isn't ready to learn. It means that it's time for you to teach them how to express what they might in fact already know. You're not foisting hard things upon them. You are honoring their agency by empowering them to talk about the realities of life. I know that we adults become deeply uncomfortable with the idea of talking with kids about racism or autism or sexuality or gender identity or illness or death or about their own bodies. This, however, is our spiritual immaturity, not theirs. Your Black and Indigenous kids already know they're Black and Indigenous. Your neurodiverse kids already are being made aware of the ways they are different and how others misunderstand and misrepresent them. Your queer and transgender kids know narratives around them are not fitting them years before they may ever have sex. The voices of bigotry don't wait for kids to grow up before they hurt the kids for being different, so we shouldn't wait to tell them that we're on their side. And your kids already have bodies that can be sick or injured or abused. They already have penises and vaginas. If they're old enough to have those body parts, they are old enough to know the names for those body parts. Personally, I was once a young, queer, effeminate, autistic kid in children's church, and I didn't know any of those words at the time. But it was already true, and I already knew it, even though I didn't have the words for it. And for better or worse, I was already being treated by peers and church leaders accordingly. We have to talk about these things sensitively, of course, and I encourage you to bring in experts, both in the topic and specifically in working with kids. In some topics, that's me. In some others, I actually can recommend some wonderful people to you. But I suggest we don't mistake our fears for theirs, and that we do not believe for a second that our refusal to talk about hard things will make them go away for our young people. It doesn't. It does model, though, that we are not the safe people to go talk to. So the world's already unsafe, and being safe people is a proactive choice we must make. In emergencies, if you have to suddenly talk with a kid about something very hard, I have a few quick tips. 1, listen for what they say exactly and don't make extra assumptions. 2, be precise, blunt, and direct, no euphemisms. 3, keep your discomfort and embarrassment to yourself. It's your problem. Get over it. And 4, answer exactly as much as they asked. No more. They'll ask follow-up questions or they'll be satiated. I believe in talking about societal injustices and sexuality and gender identity and disability and neurodiversity and health and mortality in church with kids, because kids will seek this information and they'll find some information. So we should help them get it right. They're spiritually mature. They're ready for it. The only question is, are we? Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Our concluding speaker on part 3 of children's spirituality is going to be none other than the Reverend Judy Steers.
Great, thank you, Leanne. Super happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen with you. There we go. Are we good? So I have been involved in children's ministry for a number of years, as you can see in my bio. Every time I shift into a new environment, there's a whole new set of challenges. And when Leanne invited me to come to speak today, she asked me, what would you like to talk about? And I said, I think I'd like to just talk about my latest challenge, my latest opportunity, latest thing that I am learning about. I'm really inspired by and encouraged by. I want to say, yes, all of the above for what everybody has said this morning. And so this presentation is a little bit informed by my graduate research, a little bit informed by my current experience as a chaplain in a K-12 school that has Anglican roots, but is very, very definitely an interfaith, intercultural school in its lived experience. So, so this isn't so much what you do as I think some of the things we need to think about. So there we are. So the essence of what I want to share with you is just about how we engage children in the context of the fact that they live in a pluralistic society, one in which Christianity is not the dominant mode of thinking. While we want to communicate faith to them, they are in a milieu that is really diverse and has a lot of different influences. So our children are growing up in a society that is pluralistic. I was just thinking about the grade 4 class that I taught yesterday. There were 6 different religions represented there, and within those religions, different denominations or sects. A society that is technological and science-centric, that tends towards that idea that the knowable is provable, which is certainly, an idea that we've inherited from, centuries ago, but it's really a dominant worldview that what we can know is only what we can prove. A society that is multicultural, that embraces and embodies really different worldviews, experiences, origins, and ways of being in the world, ways of thinking about the world. A society that is post-foundational. Suddenly a word leaps in from my graduate work. Post-foundational meaning, so foundationalism is the idea that our beliefs are justified by appealing to some item of knowledge that is self-evident or indubitable. It's sort of here's the baseline, everything is built on that. Our children are growing up in a social milieu where foundationalism or absolutism is held in suspicion. If we have one way of seeing something or one kind of foundational thought that everything is built on, there is a suspicion of that preconception that there's only one way of kind of basing our knowledge. And lastly, I initially wrote post-colonial, but there's no way we are post-colonial. But we are beginning to question, and our children are beginning to question, especially I think about the young people, young adults I work with, deeply questioning colonialism and colonialist mindsets of univocal dominant voices as being the voices of control or influence. So in the course of my research, I came across this fantastic quote from George Coe's A Social Theory of Religious Education, noting that this is from 1917 that he wrote this, to argue that we already possess the truth since it has been revealed, and that therefore we ought to impose beliefs upon children betrays an interesting confusion. Even if we train the pupil to say sincerely that it is the Pope, the Church, or the Bible to which the child submits, this say-so of the child is our own handiwork. We have imposed ourselves between the pupil and reality, and we have no guarantee that the truth becomes the child's own possession. Linda, Amy, Jean-Daniel, so many people spoke to this about the freedom to explore, and not just simply, put religion into a child. It's really interesting that that's an idea that has been around for a long time, over 100 years. The whole notion of transferring ready-made thoughts to the mind of another is psychologically fallacious. What we have here is neither knowledge nor belief in any vital sense, but, this is a really topical word, but partisanship. This kind of instruction in childhood produces an easily recognized adult type, the individual who settles historical and scientific question without historical and scientific study. So the elements of faith formation then need to include some particular opportunities. And again, all of the previous speakers have spoken to these in ways, but these are just overarching ideas that I invite you to think about as you contemplate how the how of children's ministry formation and spiritual accompaniment. This is based again on the work of Michael Polanyi, who is a sociologist, but also and his work. His book, Meaning, is a really profound one for people involved in education. So the elements of faith formation should include meaning making, which is the opportunity to not just receive a meaning or an interpretation, but the skills and the opportunity to make that meaning for oneself. Grounded in a mythic narrative, sacred story is at its root. And again, so many people this morning have talked about the importance of story. That includes community-based rituals, the practices that retell the human story within our life cycles, the importance of participating in the rituals of the church or the rituals of religious or faith practice, such as meditating. I'm really excited I was frantically writing down many of the things that Linda said in her presentation about like, oh, I need to go look at that. Oh, I need to go look at that. That ritual practices and why we do them are critically important. And the opportunity to invite children into spiritual experiences. Done also in a climate of intellectual freedom and mutual accountability. Again, this is all from Michael Polanyi's book, Meaning, that these are based on. One thing that I'm really conscious of in teaching in a pluralistic, in a multi-faith environment is all of my repertoire has been univocal. What I mean by that is I think about who is not in the room when I am teaching. Or these are things to think about. Who is not in the room? Do we speak in one voice because our voice is the only one present? Meaning, if we are in a Christian milieu and we are telling Christian stories, whose voices are we excluding from telling those? It's not to say that we should not tell those stories, introduce those stories, but also provide the opportunity to learn the stories, practices, and rituals of others, not as a quaint cultural kind of artifact, but as here is a living faith that is practiced within the world. Where this comes to, I'm coming back to a place of, so The Great Family, one of my favorite godly play stories to tell. I was contemplating telling the story of the Great Family in my class with my students, and I realized that it's a story, you are part of the great family that numbers more than the stars in the sky and the grains of sand in the desert. And 4 children in that class are Muslim. And there's a swath of that story that is left out that doesn't include their part of the story. Now, the godly play does incorporate other stories at different times. And this is not a critique of godly play in any way, shape, or form. I use godly play all the time, but I'm aware that how do I engage this story, knowing that it is speaking in a voice to a particular group of people, and it might leave out others. So who is not in the room? Who is in the room? How am I telling the stories? I think engagement with other religious traditions, other stories, other ways of being and seeing the world is really important for our children. It allows them to see their own story in the context of a wide variety of stories. It's not to say that this is the right story and all of the other ones are kind of not quite the right story. And I'm fairly confident that none of us think that way, but how do we actually include and embrace multi-faith learning and multi-faith appreciation into our children's learning opportunities? But it's not about creating or diving into a religious melting pot. It's not about anything goes. Rather, how do sacred texts, symbolic rituals, and community stories intersect with all aspects of human knowledge or experience? If I can see my story as it relates to other people's stories and how they've made sense of the world and how they figure out trouble and reality in their own context throughout time, helps me to really lean into my own in deeper ways.
Judy, you have like less than a minute.
Okay. So we move, sacred text and ritual participation moves away from magical thinking to a dialogue with thoughtful ways with a deepening awareness of the role that participation in ritual, sacred stories, awe, and wonder have shaped human flourishing through time. It makes it more real. Sorry, I am going to skip over that slide. My apologies, because I think I've kind of covered that point. These are just some images of things that I am doing in school these days. This is a story we've created called The Story of Stories, which introduces the idea of story, symbol, narrative, color, how stories are taught and shared and embraced, and what we learn, how we shape our identity by them. We have used elements of godly play. This week we have been doing origin stories. We have also, in addition to Christian canon, we have also embraced things like these are the elements of the story Sky Woman and the Turtle, which we are also telling as part of origin stories and inviting children to see the connections between cultural origin stories and how they all speak to what is important and how it shapes our identity and who we are in the world, and learn to embrace diversity and work for a common vision.
Yay.
And see.
And thank you so much. That was brilliant. As always, I could have listened to you for the whole time, but we'll have to do this another time and give you a little more time to talk because you're the best. That wraps up our concluding section on children's spirituality, but we do have a bonus for you because, you know, who doesn't like a bonus at the end of anything? And nothing is more important. I think I want to punctuate all of our presentations with an emphasis on play. So Tanya Moxley has graciously agreed to give us an even shorter than 9-minute presentation, maybe up to 5 minutes on this topic. So Tanya, welcome aboard. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and talk about play.
Good morning. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. I'm in the lobby of a hotel finishing up another conference, so hopefully this will work. So good morning. I'm Tanya. I am coming to you from Halifax, Nova Scotia. I am a cradle Anglican, but who also happens to work as a play ranger. What is that? Basically, I collect up really interesting junk. I take it to places where kids play, and I let them play with it, with no plan, no agenda, no expected outcome. The rules are be kind, be safe, have fun. Little did I know 4 years ago when I started in the play world, how it was going to connect to my church world. You've spent a lot of time this morning hearing about ministry for children and many ways to engage in young people in God's work. It's important to remember that we are called to this work because the God of mission has a church in the world that is here to be God's hand and feet and hearts. And what does play have to do with that? Is it just about kids? Well, what's play anyway? In my world, play is any activity that is freely chosen, intrinsically motivated, and self-directed. You'll notice that makes no mention of age. So yes, play is for everyone, not just people under 18. What does that have to do with church? Well, we're made in the image of God, and we spend our earliest years learning to be human through play. Surely this God we worship is also playful then? Surely this God who showed such wild, glorious creativity in building this universe, this planet, these humans, wants us to play too, to be creative too? That doesn't mean that play ignores the suffering in the world. In fact, play is how children and sometimes adults most effectively work through and process their way through pain and suffering and even trauma. Play is not all fun. Play can be deep and sometimes scary. Nothing about freely chosen, intrinsically motivated, and self-directed says that it's all lighthearted. The field of play therapy helps people who are struggling to work through trauma to do it through play. We can, in fact, choose to enter into play knowing that it might be scary. Isn't that how a haunted house works at Halloween? What about rock climbing or parachute jumping or tidal bore rafting? We engage in them on purpose, even though they might be terrifying. So let's not give play a bad rap by assuming it has to be all Pictionary and games of tag. Let's consider, for example, creating a youth-based activity for a church. Anytime we design an activity or an event, we should always start with why. And if that's clear, everything else tends to follow. So if the why is about building relationships with a group of young people to eventually share God's story with them, why does an element of play matter? Well, there's a quote attributed to Dr. Karen Purvis about people learning through play 10 to 20 times faster than any other way. Why would that be? Probably because of the freely chosen bit. Because when we choose to engage, different parts of our brain light up. So if, for example, you gather a group of older elementary age children and you really want to tell a story and that's your plan, but they won't sit still and listen, then what? Do you throw the whole story idea out the window? It can be super frustrating to spend a lot of time planning an activity only to find out that your audience does not like your plan. So why not make the storytelling more playful? Let them act out the parts. Have those who can read volunteer to read parts. Read it a bit at a time as they draw out what's happening. Let them choose how they want to engage with the story. We got to keep in mind, most kids sit still for way too long during the school week, and one more sitting still activity might be the last thing they need or want. How might we structure our time with them so that they have time to move, to engage in big body play? Do you have some loose parts that they can hold, move, manipulate, combine with other materials to let them show what they're learning? Things like sheets, plastic pipes, containers, tape, scissors. If something has gone off the rails, ask yourself, who is this for anyway? If it's for the glory of God, to build relationships with young people who've never heard this stuff before, who desperately need to learn about the God who loves them unconditionally, no strings attached, then the plan is what we need to change. Children and young people are not stupid or helpless or in need of constant protection from the world and everyone in it. They are intelligent, empathetic, curious, built to learn. Our role is to facilitate that and to find ways to say yes, to find out how they want to learn, to plant the seeds of God's love and make space for the Spirit to do its amazing work. May all of you feel the love of God accompanying you on the journey as you seek to sow those seeds. Amen.
Amen. He just got an applause from my wife, who's a kindergarten teacher over here. She's like, yahoo. I wanted to just thank you again for being here. Thank you to the panel of presenters for inspiring us. I think that we did accomplish our goal of inspiring children's ministry today. We've heard from a lot of adults in this session this morning, but I want you to know that the part 2 of this Children's Ministry Matters initiative is going to be about listening. So I'm going to embark on a project in 2022, a project of listening, and I will be reporting back to all of you with the results of what the kids have to say. So stay tuned for that. Let's all unmute our microphones, and if you are able to say the grace in the language of your choice, go right ahead and do that. Let's make it really messy and chaotic, because that's what children's ministry is all about. So unmute yourselves and say grace on the count of 3.
Jesus Christ.
Grace of our
Lord Jesus Christ, and the love of God, fellowship of the Holy Spirit, be with you all.
Amen.
Amen.
Yay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.